Chapter 7. There is a great evil about, the doctor mused aloud to Ace the following morning, after she had told him of Raphael's nightmares. An entire race forgetting their own past and meekly accepting whatever is given to them. Millions of years of evolution compressed into a few centuries. And behind it all, somehow, the Pangistri like grandmasters playing with the Kerathons as if they're pawns. He paced the room, repeatedly hitting his fist into his open palm. What's the point of it all, Ace? What's the purpose? Ace shrugged. I told you there was something wrong about the whole setup, didn't I? Even the weather's having an identity crisis. The doctor looked through the window of Ace's room. The warm sunshine of the previous day had now given way to bleak wintry skies and biting winds. The doctor shook his head despairingly. Climatic changes like this shouldn't just happen. Did you see the dark fell last night? Ace shook her head, and the doctor elaborated. Mirill pointed it out to me. It's a range of hills a few miles to the west of here, poisoned and riddled with pollution, or so he says. It glows, Ace. Bad case of the Sellafield blues? The doctor took a small Geiger counter out of one of his pockets. If it is radiation, it's of a kind that doesn't show up on this. So what do we do now? There's something happening on this planet that I don't understand. I want to know what it is, but we must tread carefully. Tanyel doesn't trust me. She's only allowing me to run free because of Mirill, and I suspect this Lord Huldar is only waiting for an opportunity to get us out of the way without any blame falling on him. What do you want me to do? Somehow Raphael's the key to all this. He's the only one who's remembering things he's not supposed to. Stay with him. Find out what else he can remember about his friend. What's his name? Darian. Yes, if we can find out what happened to him, then we're halfway to an answer. And Ace. Yes, Professor? The doctor winked knowingly at her. Try not to make Revna even more jealous than she already is. She's got no reason to be. Ace's cheeks reddened at the doctor's suggestion. The doctor raised a disbelieving eyebrow. No? She quickly changed the subject. And what are you going to do, Professor? Said the doctor with enthusiasm, I am going rock climbing. Raphael was waiting for Ace on the rocks by the seashore, not far from where the TARDIS had landed. He was wearing a long, furry coat to protect him from the biting winds. As she approached, he jumped nervously to his feet. When he saw who it was, he relaxed. You sure this is okay? Asked Ace. He nodded. It'll be safe to talk. No one ever comes down here. No one, that was, except Revna, and she had followed Ace at a discreet distance ever since she left the town this morning. She cursed through clenched teeth as she saw Raphael welcome her rival. Quickly she hid herself behind a large rock and strained to hear their conversation above the whine of the wind. Raphael took Ace's hand and led her up onto the rocks, steadying her when she slipped on the seaweed and shale. From this vantage point, he pointed out to sea. Ace pulled her windswept hair out of her eyes and gazed at the rocky island about a mile out to sea. Squinting in the sunlight, she could make out a few tall trees and a group of buildings in the centre of the island. So that's Kandassi, she said, clearly unimpressed. The home of the Pangistri. It's where Darian was sent. And you think he's still there? Raphael shrugged. I thought of swimming there once. I got into the most terrible trouble. It's probably more than anyone else would have done. But don't you have boats? Only for freshwater fishing. The Pangistri forbid us to sail on the sea. It's for your own protection, she mimicked. Have you ever thought it might be for the Pangistri's protection? Be fair, Ace, he protested, unable to dismiss 24 years of indoctrination in one night. They provide us with so many things and forbid us so few. Sea travel, the Darkfell, entry to the harbours. The harbours? Raphael indicated a small tree-lined bay about half a mile along the coastline. It's where the Pangistri disembark when they visit us from Kandassi. Well, that's just what we need. Raphael looked puzzled. Ace sighed. Do I have to spell it out for you? Raphael nodded. Yes, please. Ace raised her eyes heavenwards. Some Christopher Columbus you'd make. We sneak into the harbours, wait until one of their boats pulls in, and then hide on board. But, Ace cut him dead, do you want to know what happened to your friend, or don't you? Raphael nodded uncertainly. So are you with me or not? Raphael looked out at Kandassi, and then back to Kirith Town, and beyond that to the mysterious and forbidden Darkfell. And then to the young woman who had saved his life and in whom he felt some strange kindred spirit. The young woman who had already upset the lives of many of his friends and was even now daring to break one of the most closely observed rules of all Kirith. But it wasn't her iconoclasm that fascinated him, nor her energy, not even her less than perfect beauty. Beneath her unpredictable and at times aggressive exterior, there was a tremendous amount of fun and a desire to live life to the fullest. And Raphael, and all of Kirith, had not lived life to the full for such a long time. He took a deep breath, scarcely realising what he was committing himself to. I'm with you, Ace. Revna had heard enough. Her eyes smarting with tears she would not allow to fall, she made her way quickly back to the Lord Hulda. Long, long ago, even before the Pangistri came to Kirith, a great race dwelt on the planet. They were men of vast abilities and great learning. They were also accomplished architects and builders, and raised magnificent buildings and temples to their gods. But as the ages passed, so they were consumed with greed and envy of their fellow man. Conflicts broke out between rival towns, wars were declared between continents, and hideous engines of destruction were built. Within decades, the original Kirithons had become extinct, having wiped themselves out with their own death machines. Even today, the Darkfell was still blighted with their poisons. But their buildings survived, touched only by the uncaring passage of time. To the new species which arose on Kirith, these ruins stood as a reminder of the barbarity and futility of war. One such ruin lay a few miles inland from Kirith Town. When Mirill had told him about his existence, the doctor had shown a keen interest in seeing them for himself. Perhaps in the ruins of the past he would find the answers which the records on Kirith concealed. The doctor looked up uncertainly at the ruins, which lay isolated about halfway up a steep, rocky tor. "It's a long way up," he said without much enthusiasm. "Are you sure you're up to it, Mirill?" Mirill looked hurt. "I'm only 250 years old, Doctor. I'm not yet ready for retirement," he reminded him, "and it might be amusing." "Of course," said the doctor, and smiled knowingly. "You know, Mirill, I suspect you were a bit of a tearaway in your younger days. Not dissimilar to our young friend Raphael, in fact." "I raised Raphael as my ward from the age of 14, Mirill said, neatly avoiding the question. "Now may I suggest that we start to climb?" A pathway of sorts twisted its way halfway up the tor, and so the initial part of the journey proved not particularly difficult. From that point, however, it became steeper, and the two men found themselves having to look out for footholds and projecting rocks which they would use to haul themselves up. For a man of his age, Mirill was surprisingly nimble, and more than once he had had to stop to help the doctor. The doctor accepted the assistance begrudgingly. It was all right for Mirill, he thought ruefully. This wasn't the first time he had made the trip, he suspected. Besides, he was a Time Lord, not a blessed mountain goat. Occasionally they would trip and stumble on loose stones, or the wind would blow them slightly off balance. Because the tor ascended by a series of small plateaux, they weren't in danger of their lives, but a fall down to the previous ledge could still result in broken limbs. After about half an hour's climbing, they stopped to rest on a large overhanging ledge. Some 20 feet above them was the summit. Looking enviously at Mirill, who didn't seem in the slightest tired, the doctor paused to catch his breath and to take a look at the surrounding area. He took a small brass telescope out of a pocket of his duffel coat. Mirill looked at it with fascination. The doctor offered it to him. He put the wrong end to his eye before the doctor corrected him with a smile. "An invention of an Italian friend of mine," he said airily. From this vantage point he could see that Kirith Town and its immediate environs were effectively cut off from the rest of the countryside. The tor on which they were standing was to the south of Kirith Town, and formed one of the foothills of a vast range of mountains, which, Muriel said, spanned the entire continent. To the west and east ran two rivers, one of which provided fresh water for the town, the other of which flowed through the Darkfell, still forbidding and inscrutable, even in the daylight. Further to the east was the bay, which Muriel called the Harbour of the Chosen, and, beyond that, a dense forest of tall, dark trees. And, as always, out in the northern seas, the brooding, watchful presence of Kandassi Island. Muriel handed the telescope back to the doctor, who insisted that he keep it, suggesting he could use it to look at the stars. Muriel thanked him effusively. "It is indeed a wonderful device, Doctor," he said with awe. "You must tell me how to make one." "I have no doubt your computers could tell you, if you could program them correctly," he replied, and continued to look thoughtfully out at Kandassi. So intent was the doctor in looking seawards that he failed to notice the telltale signs of stones and small rocks skittering and falling down the steep sides of the tor. Muriel dived at the doctor, striking him in the small of the back and sending him flying towards the edge of the ledge. A massive boulder came thundering down the side of the tor, smashing down onto the very spot where the doctor had been standing just a moment before. It crashed to a halt for a second before tumbling off the side of the ledge and continued to roll down to the ground some 100 feet below. The already fragile ledge had been weakened by the impact and began to crack and crumble. As the ledge tottered over into space, the doctor frantically clawed his way to secure ground. His legs hung over the edge, waving frantically in the winds. His hat was knocked off his head and floated down to the ground. With one hand grabbing hold of some hardy shrubs for support, Muriel reached out with his other hand for the doctor. Their fingers met, and with aching and straining muscles, Muriel pulled the doctor away from the edge. The doctor sat up, an undignified mess, and wiped at a small cut above his eye with a handkerchief. "Thank you, Muriel," he said breathlessly. Muriel just smiled. "It was purely a selfish act, Doctor," he said. "After all, I couldn't let all your knowledge go to waste, could I?" "Nevertheless, thank you." The doctor shaded his eyes from the sun and looked up at the top of the tor. "Boulders don't just dislodge themselves and fall like that," he said. "I think someone doesn't want us to reach the top, Muriel." Muriel frowned. A few days ago he could not even have contemplated the idea that there were people on Kirith prepared to deceive and to kill their fellow men. Now it was beginning to seem commonplace. "So what do we do now, Doctor?" "Why, we go over the top, of course." "Have you never wished for the peaceful life, Doctor?" Muriel sighed. The doctor shook his head and chuckled. "Lots of people have asked me that. It's much more fun my way." Dusting himself off, he stood up to begin the final climb. 10 minutes later, the doctor and Muriel had reached the summit of the tor. The wind whistled through the shattered skeletons of buildings, and toppled pillars and piles of rubble littered the ground, the ruins of what had once been a small settlement and lookout post to sea. The doctor bent down and picked up a handful of ash. He let it slip slowly through his fingers. The ash was, after all, the unavoidable result of each and every war. If the Pangistri had indeed saved the Kirithons from this horror, did he really have the right to interfere? He stood up and looked around sadly, and then he frowned. Surely something wasn't quite right here. "How long have these ruins been here, Muriel?" 5,000 or 6,000 years. They are all that remains of the original inhabitants of our planet. We leave them here as a lesson that we should never misuse our technology the way they misused theirs." The doctor fumbled in his pockets and took out a small device, roughly the size and shape of a pocket calculator. "It's a radiation detector, among other things," he explained to Muriel, as he clicked it on and began walking among the destroyed buildings. When he returned, his brow was creased with concern. He tapped the device as if to ensure that it was functioning properly. "What's wrong, Doctor?" "In this area, between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, there was a terrible nuclear war. The original Kirithans split the atom, yes? So even now, this place should be steeped in some residual radiation." The doctor drew Muriel's attention to the radiation detector. "There isn't even the slightest trace of radiation, natural or unnatural. The only radiation anywhere on this entire planet is Artron energy. Myrrell looked at him blankly as he continued, "And now I know exactly where it's coming from." "Where, Doctor?" The Doctor snorted angrily. "Where do you think?" The two men gazed out at Kandassi Island. The Doctor turned away disgustedly and looked back at the ruins. "There's more than one sort of radiation this little device can detect," he said as he jabbed at several further buttons. "There's one more test I want to make. It won't be as effective as a laboratory experiment, but it will tell me what I need to know." He passed the device over the dead husk of a tree which had been felled when a pillar had fallen on top of it. For a second the detector buzzed and whirred, and then beeped its conclusions onto a tiny LCD screen. With a sense of bitter triumph, the Doctor showed the results to Myrrell. "What have you done, Doctor?" "A rudimentary carbon-14 test," he answered, and when Myrrell looked blank, added, "Something they would never teach you. It's designed to give an approximate age to any organic structure." "And what does it tell you?" "I rather suspect you've already guessed, Myrrell," the Doctor said. 6,000 years, you say? More like 600. Like the library records, those ruins are a fake, a sop to make you think you had a history, and a warning to you not to develop a technology that might one day threaten the Pangistery. There never was a war. There never was another race on this planet. This world is much too young and sterile to support intelligent life anyway. Myrrell's eyes blazed with curiosity and an unexpected delight. You mean we're not Kerathons? That we come from the stars? Did this explain his fascination with the heavens, wondered Myrrell? Was it because his race was actually born out there in the great void? This whole planet is a giant crucible, continued the Doctor, and the Kerathons are part of some evil experiment that was begun here long ago. Myrrell, the experiment must stop. As the Doctor and Myrrell began their descent down to the ground, Huldar moved out of the ruined building in which he had been hiding. His attempt to kill the Doctor with the boulder had failed, but with what the Doctor now knew, it was even more imperative that he be disposed of. Nothing could be allowed to interfere with the task of the Pangistery, especially now that the Omega point was so close. Yet even as he plotted ways to rid himself of the Doctor, the Lord Procurator Huldar allowed himself a small, self-satisfied smile. The Time Lord was a genius, certainly, but Huldar knew something that even he didn't. The Doctor was wrong, fatally wrong, for the Kerathons were very much natives of this planet. Both they and the world on which they had lived had been created for one special and overriding purpose. And he, Huldar, alone on all Kirith, knew what that purpose was. Although the harbours were only half a mile along the coast, it took Ace and Raphael over 2 hours to reach them. As they approached the bay, the rocky coastline rose to high, unscalable cliffs, and the pair were forced to travel inland through dense woods. When they arrived, it was late afternoon. They stood at the top of a small hill and looked down into the bay below. If there was anything to contrast with Kirith Town, thought Ace, then this was it. Whereas Kirith, in all its Gothic splendour, buzzed with sumptuous life, the harbours were cold and dead. Nothing grew here, apart from a few shrubs struggling to survive. Even the trees near the shore were bare and charred. The only sound was the sea as it crashed against the rocks on the shore, and the wind whistling through the bleakness and desolation. Otherwise, a shroud of silence hung over the place. If the Doctor had been there, he would have recognised it at once for what it was, the silence of death. The same silence that hangs over Auschwitz and Treblinka. Several drab and windowless buildings stood along the sea edge. Grey and functional, little more than large concrete boxes, they reminded Ace of old abandoned military bases. 4 watchtowers surrounded the base, but they were unmanned. Obviously the Kerathons' unquestioning obedience made their use unnecessary. For a moment the pair stood silently until Ace remembered what they had come here for. She looked seawards, but no boats were moored in the bay. Let's just go back then, said Raphael, a little too eagerly. He had no wish to stay here a moment longer than necessary. Ace looked at him with undisguised contempt. Not on your life! On the way, Raphael had told her that though the Pangistery were infrequent visitors to Kirith Town, they visited the harbours on a regular basis. For what purpose, no one knew. Ace intended to wait until they came. In the meantime, she was going to explore the base. It was high time that she found out what was really happening on this planet. She began to make her way down towards the buildings, then she turned and looked at Raphael. Well, are you coming or not? Raphael hesitated, and then, accepting the inevitable, followed Ace down the hill. As they approached the buildings, they could see no sign of life at all, not even refuse or discarded machinery. Everything was ordered and precise, as though the base had not been used for years. Each of the buildings had a large rusted iron door. With the nervous Raphael in tow, Ace tried every one of them. All were locked. "There's nothing here, Ace. Let's get back." "No way, Sunshine," she said, and slung her rucksack off her back. "What are you doing?" She grinned. "Causing a few hiccups in paradise. Now stand back." She opened her bag and took out what to Raphael appeared to be 2 cans of female deodorant. She placed them by the door of a small cement hut, took off their caps and stood back, bumping into Raphael, who had ignored her advice and was watching over her shoulder. "Get back, will you?" she shouted. She pushed him down as the 2 cans of Nitro-9 exploded with a deafening roar, blowing the iron door inwards. "Wicked!" cried Ace. "Not very ozone-friendly, of course, but you can't have everything." Raphael just lay on the floor, shocked beyond belief. No one else was anything like Ace. His mouth was open wide in amazement. Ace leant down and obligingly shut it for him. "Are they all like you in Perry Vale?" he gulped. "Nah, some of them are really violent," she said. "Now, let's see what we've got here." To their surprise, the building was empty. Steps led down below ground. Ace took a flashlight out of her bag and urged Raphael to follow. "Wow! Hammer horror!" whistled Ace as they reached the bottom after about 5 minutes' descent. "It's like something out of a Frankenstein movie." A vast laboratory had been set up in an underground cavern. Row upon row of workbenches cluttered with specimen jars and scientific equipment whose use they could only guess at filled the vast cavern. Along one rock wall, computers whirred, automatically analysing and processing data. A series of empty barred cages lined the opposite wall. Another wall was almost completely taken up with an enormous screen upon which columns and rows of numbers and formulae and complex 3-dimensional graphic designs flashed with staggering rapidity. Ace could make neither head nor tail of any of them. High above their heads, a maze of transparent pipes crisscrossed, carrying viscous liquids which were fed into a large vat at the far end of the cavern. Huge monitors hung from the ceiling, displaying moving geometric patterns which pulsed and reconfigured themselves to a heartbeat rhythm. In spite of several ventilation shafts which buzzed noisily, a noxious, familiar smell pervaded the entire cavern. Raphael looked around in amazement. "This is what the Pangistri do here. But what's it all for?" Ace strode over to one of the workbenches. She screwed up her face in disgust as she looked at some of the specimen jars. "Horrible stuff," she muttered to herself. Each of the specimen jars was filled with a perfectly preserved human or animal embryo, and Ace now recognised the ubiquitous smell as formaldehyde. Not all the specimens were fully developed, some were little more than small glutinous masses of cells. On another workbench, 3 grey heavy lumps floated in tanks of effervescent fluid into which had been inserted copper electrodes. Meters by the sides of the jars recorded any neurological activity in the brains as charges of electricity were pulsed through them. In a corner, 2 disembodied hearts pumped away in a tank of foul-smelling nutrients. Looking up at one of the monitors, Ace recognised a graphic representation of the dual ribbons of the DNA molecule, the building block of life. "They're biologists," she said. "What?" "Didn't they teach you biology at school?" she asked, already knowing the answer before Raphael had the chance to shake his head. "This is where Darian came?" asked Raphael. Ace shrugged. She didn't like to think of the answer. These specimens, after all, had to come from somewhere, and she would bet that the Pangistri wouldn't donate their own precious organs for the sake of their experiments. She took a disc off a desk and inserted it into a wall-mounted computer. For a second, the computer whirred, processing the data, and then the monitor was filled with a sequence of stylized images. A small dot flickered alone in the centre of the screen. Steadily it grew until it exploded, sending dots and beams of light out into every direction like an incredible firework display. Almost faster than the eye could see, they raced out until the entire screen was covered with the tiny moving pinpricks of light. And then, imperceptibly at first, their progress slowed until they came to a halt. For a full half-minute there was no movement on the screen. Then, at first slowly, and then ever faster, the beams of light fell in upon themselves, drawing closer and closer to their centre, until there was nothing left on the screen but the original bright pinprick of light. And then it too blipped out of existence, leaving only the silent blackness of the computer screen. Ace dimly recognised the pattern she had just seen. But before she could remember, she heard a strained whisper behind her. "Ace?" While she had been looking at the screen, Raphael had wandered off to a small room set apart from the main laboratory. Through its open doorway pulsed a cold, unearthly blue light. Ace followed the sound of his voice and felt herself gag as a stench like that of dead and rotting fish filled the air. In the centre of the room stood a huge, transparent, open-topped cylinder, about 9 feet high, into which several pumps fed blue nutrient fluid. A tangle of wires ran off from the cylinder to digital display meters set in the far wall. Thrashing about in the tank was a creature from a nightmare. Its bulbous head, overdeveloped in comparison to the rest of its body, reminded Ace of nothing more than a monstrously overgrown fetus. But there all resemblance to the human form ended. Suspended in the blue-green liquid, its limbs, Ace counted 8 in all, splayed from its underdeveloped torso and jerked about, some battering at the walls of the cylinder which imprisoned it, some reaching upwards for the oxygen-rich air above it. Some were small and weak, little more than scrawny sticks of gristle. Others were strong and well-developed, their 6-fingered hands clenching and flexing reflexively. Part of its stomach was open, and long tubular organs covered with a thick mucus poured out of it, swaying back and forth as the creature turned and twisted, writhing in its own excrement, blood and vomit. Part of its lungs and twin hearts were exposed too, and they expanded and contracted, breathing in the life-giving nutrient all around it. Several oversized eyes protruded from its skull, each of them looking in different directions, blinking in the harsh light of the laboratory. The creature had no ears, but a small, ineffectual, lipless mouth constantly opened and closed, fish-like, gulping greedily at the life-giving fluid which surrounded it. When it saw Ace and Raphael, its eyes fixed them with a baleful stare, and its mouth let out a hideous, blood-curling screech, like the caw of a trapped and tortured bird, holding them responsible for its present situation. It moved its head with difficulty. Electrodes connected to a bank of meters outside the cylinder restricted its movements considerably. Small copper-plated conductors attached to generators at the far end of the room punctuated the cylinder, sending short flashes of energy through the creature's body. For the split second that its body was lit up and suffused with energy, its nerves and nascent, pliable bones became visible. Each time the energy bolts coursed through its body, it screamed in torment, twisting and convulsing, and globs of flesh and guts would detach themselves from its body to float in the oily fluid. The world spinned sickeningly around Ace, and she turned away. To her utter disgust, she found herself throwing up. A white-faced Raphael was by her side in an instant. She pushed him away. "I'm all right," she snapped, and forced herself to look at the creature in the tank. The creature returned her stare with the fear and hate given to anything that is different. "They're breeding it," she said incredulously. "Creating it out of mutated cells and dead organs." "What is it?" asked Raphael. "Your salvation." The two turned around, and Raphael gripped Ace's arm tightly. "Lord Reptu!" he gasped. Reptu shook his head sadly and looked down at them. His weak eyes regarded them sternly, like a disappointed headmaster reproving 2 wayward students. "The homunculus is the first of an entirely new species," he said. "A creature of infinite aggression, created especially to be the saviour of your race, Raphael. Indeed, of all races." "It's horrible!" cried Ace. "Obscene!" Raphael urged her to be quiet and show due respect. "Ace, he's a Pangistri," he hissed. Ace shook herself away from his arm. "I don't care who he is. I want some explanations." She poked at Reptu with her finger. "What's going on here, Grandad?" To her fury, Reptu just smiled as one would to a capricious child. If anything, her anger and aggression seemed to delight him. You will soon find out, Earthchild. Both you and the Doctor are part of our great plan. Ace caught the threat in his voice, and a thrill of terror ran down her spine. She pushed past the old man, who did nothing to stop her, and called Raphael to follow her. Reptu snapped his fingers, and from out of the shadows lumbered 6 companions, brothers to fetch. Their teeth were bared threateningly, and they slavered and snarled as they circled Ace and Raphael like cats stalking their prey. "There is no escape for either of you now," said Reptu flatly. "Now that you have been here, you have no choice but to join our brotherhood." He turned to Ace. "It is your destiny." "My lord, we meant no harm," Raphael pleaded, his Kirithan upbringing once again superseding Ace's influence. "Let us go, and your secret is safe with us." "Like hell they are," cried Ace, and grabbed Raphael's arm. "I'm not ending up like that thing. Come on!" Dragging Raphael with her, she tried to barge past the companions. They closed in on her, their claws pawing at her body, tearing at her jacket. Shocked into action, Raphael tried to stop them, only to be swatted aside like an irritating insect. The companion's sole concern was Ace. She shrugged off her backpack and raised it above her head, swinging it around like a club. The companions backed away, and Ace ceased her chant, diving through the opening in the circle, pulling Raphael after her. As the band of companions followed them, Ace swept the contents of a workbench to the floor. Several burettes smashed onto the floor, releasing noxious fumes into the air and sending the companions, with their acute sense of smell, into fits of coughing and spluttering. "Get after them!" cried Reptu, his entire body shaking with rage and frustration. "Everything depends on the girl." Delayed by the fumes for only seconds, one of the companions leapt after them, grabbing Ace's backpack and knocking both it and her down to the ground. Raphael snatched the bag and swung it full into the creature's face. With a yelp of pain, it backed away, blood streaming from its snout. Ace and Raphael ran out of the laboratory, upsetting workbenches and containers on the way to impede further their pursuers' progress. As a companion came close, Ace swung at it with her heavy flashlight. Their hearts pumping furiously, they climbed the steps leading up to the outside. Caught up in the thrill of the hunt, the companions reverted to the animals they had once been. Growling and baying, they snapped angrily at Ace and Raphael's heels. Outside, night had fallen. Clouds obscured the moons, and it was pitch black. Seeking refuge behind a building, Ace turned to Raphael. "Go!" she panted. "They can't hunt both of us. It's me they want, not you." He shook his head violently. "Listen! I've got no time for arguing. Find the Professor. Tell him what's happening." Nearby, they heard the companions exiting the building, pausing to sniff at the wind for their scent. "Ace, I can't leave you." "Get lost, Raphael. Save yourself." With a bay of triumph, the companions detected their presence. As one hungry herd, they raced towards their prey.